speaker is Dr. Rob Graf. He is a principal research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Dr. Rob also a chair of Alberta Regional Variety Advisory Committee. Thanks a lot, Dr. Rob, for joining us. I know you are very busy, and now the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Khalil. I guess I'll go right into the presentation. Just for those of you who don't know me, I'm a wheat breeder at Lethbridge. I've been there for over 21 years and been breeding wheat for well over 30 years. Started my my career back in the 80s with Saskatchewan Wheat Pool, where I spent 12 years as a spring wheat breeder. And if you know the varieties Mackenzie or Prodigy, older varieties now, they are my first varieties. Back, as I said, 21 years ago, I moved to Lethbridge and I took over the winter wheat breeding program, and basically I'm breeding winter wheat exclusively since that time. So I'll see if I can share my screen here. Yeah, okay. So let's see if we can do that. Okay, so one of the questions I often get about regional variety trials is, why do we need them? You know, we grow registration trials. The varieties are registered, so aren't they already fully tested? And to some extent, that's correct. But maybe what would be a good idea is just to talk a little bit about what the intent of registration trials really are. And so in those trials, what we're really trying to do is establish what the basic characteristics of the lines under test are. And this is a mandate that comes from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And the question that they have is, will growth of a particular line, or if it's registered as a variety, cause harm to the industry? So some things that you might think about are, you know, if a line of spring wheat was brought in that was super late maturing, came from another country or something like that, where they have a much longer growing season, could it be grown in Western Canada safely, that farmers could actually get it off? Does it have disease resistance characteristics that allow it to be grown successfully, and so on, and not cause potential harm to other varieties around it? So that's really the whole idea behind registration. Of course, with registration, we also look at quality, and that isn't necessarily a CFIA mandate. That tends to come from the Canadian Grain Commission, and there's that interplay between the Seeds Act and the Grains Act that goes on, particularly in some of the cereals. Depending on the crop, there's 2 or 3 years of evaluation. Certainly in most types of wheat, it's 3 years. And there are nuances for each crop type. Various characteristics are taken, of course, different disease resistance characteristics, and so on. And we measure yield and agronomics, pest resistance, normally diseases, but in some cases insect resistance as well. Good examples of that would be the solid stem characteristic for resistance to wheat stem softfly in wheat, or orange wheat blossom midge resistance in wheat, those types of things. And of course, in the case of wheat, we do measure quality in order to allow it to be classified. This last point here, I think, is key. And one of the reasons why we need regional variety trials. The basic requirement for wheat is a minimum of 8 sites per year and 2 per province for 3 years. And so that it's enough data to make a determination as to whether or not a variety will cause harm and to establish those basic characteristics, but it certainly doesn't give us a good idea how well a variety is adapted to smaller regional areas. So the regional variety trials fine-tune agronomic performance data. And so, of course, every province runs them, and we try to get these trials dotted across the province at as many sites as we can. And this is the data that helps to form the tables in the Alberta Seed Guide and the varieties of cereal and oilseed crops for Alberta. Now, it's not the only data that goes in there, and I'll mention the sources of data in a couple of minutes, but certainly by way of the lion's share of the data, this is what's in those tables. The disease ratings come from the registration trials, but there is an annual review. Varieties that are registered are observed annually to see if there are shifts in susceptibility for various diseases, but that basic rating comes from the registration trials based on controlled tests that are inoculated to get a good idea what the resistance is like. And of course, the regional variety trials are an excellent extension tool, not just from the standpoint of the variety or the seed guides, but being able to get out to these sites in the country to take a look at what the new varieties look like. So I should talk a little bit about the RVTs in Alberta, and data for the Alberta Seed Guide comes from a lot of different sources, and I'm not going to go through all of them. Certainly, Alberta Agriculture and Forestry has some sites. We participate as Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. University of Alberta participates, and then you have a great many of the research associations, and right in the middle there, you see Battle River Research Group. And Khalil was just telling me a little bit earlier today how the number of trials that they have at their site has almost doubled over the past 2 or 3 years. So, of course, running trials is never cheap, and in Alberta, funding for the trials comes from various sources, and there certainly is a fee for entry of the varieties that are being tested, and I believe the fee this year was $1,400 per variety for cereals and flax, and there needs to be a commitment to test the variety for 3 years. So it's we believe it's good value for the money, but at the same time, it isn't. It is also, you know, not trivial. There is also funding from Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, and that comes in the form of Alex Fedko, who coordinates the trials, sets them up, inspects them, analyzes the data, and puts the tables together with help from various experts throughout the industry. The various commissions also help to fund these trials, and certainly it's no secret, and we certainly recognize that the funding that the commissions get is directly from farmers. And so thank you very much for that. We get a large grant from the Alberta Wheat Commission to run wheat trials, Alberta Barley Commission as well, Alberta Oat Growers, Alberta Seed Growers and Seed Processors, and the Prairie Oat Growers Association also supports the efforts. Okay, so moving to 2020 and what are in the trials, I should mention that RVAC, or the Alberta Regional Variety Advisory Committee, is responsible and helps to coordinate the trialing of all cereals and flax across Alberta. Pulses are looked after by the Alberta Pulse Commission, and then forages have been in the past looked after directly by Alberta Agriculture. So in the trials in 2020, we have a total of 48 experimental wheat lines, or newly registered wheat lines, I should say, not including the checks. There are 17 new barley varieties, 4 oat, 2 triticale, and 3 flax. So if you add that all up, it's probably around 80 different varieties, and when you include checks, it's well over 90 different varieties. So from the standpoint of checks, of course, are well-known long-term varieties, and comparisons are always back to that check. We do make an attempt to coordinate what those checks are with Saskatchewan, just to allow producers to make some comparisons a little bit more readily. Of course, in Manitoba, if you have ever had a chance to look at their guide, they don't actually have a standardized check. They report their results in bushels per acre exclusively, and not by percentages. There are some advantages to that, but there are also some disadvantages, and we've chosen, as has Saskatchewan, to stick with a percent back to the check. One of the things that producers have asked us over the years is to change the checks more often, because as we get more and more new varieties, there's greater turnover and faster turnover of these varieties. Of course, this is difficult because we want to have a check that has long-term data, so we can make valid comparisons to the new varieties. A way around this was to introduce what we call benchmark checks, and we did that starting in 2018. And these are the top 2 varieties based on crop insurance data that were the most popular across the province in the previous year. And so those are included in the trials and supported by the funding that we receive to provide more pertinent comparisons with the varieties in the trial. So we hope that this is something useful for producers, and those can change from year to year. Generally, a benchmark check will be in for 2 or 3 years if it becomes popular, but it's kind of a rolling check that you'll see change from year to year. And of course, the long-term check varieties do also change as time goes on. So I wanted to talk just briefly about what makes a good trial. And I think this goes across many different types of trials, but I wanted to talk specifically about the regional variety trials today. And of course, it all starts with quality seed, certified seed or its equivalent, coming from usually the people who develop the variety. The seed is germination tested, and all of the seed is seed treated to prevent spread of Fusarium head blight. We have established protocols, and Alex Fedko, who looks after the regional variety trials here in Alberta and is with the province, does an annual review that's mandatory for anyone who grows the trials. And so if there are any changes, everyone is up to date on what's happening, and it's a little bit of a jog to the memory on how to run a good trial. Of course, the reputation of cooperators is also very important. We don't just give a regional variety trial to anyone. Based on recommendations and reputation, we will allow the various groups to grow these trials. However, if there's failure through negligence of the plots and so on, for a couple of years, they're put on notice, and they're not allowed to grow the trials unless they can demonstrate that things have changed. Of course, there needs to be appropriate trial location. Uniform land, free from gradients, free from various problems, herbicide-resistant weeds, those types of things. All of the trials are replicated. They all have 3 reps. And of course, with the growth of the trial, we need to have good conduct of the plots and good maintenance. So some of the things that we look for are border plots on each side of the test, so that the plots at the edge of a test don't have an advantage compared to those that are in the middle. All the plots need to be the same size, at least at harvest, and so trimming may need to take place. Fertility to soil test recommendations. There should be good weed control, free from volunteer crops, those types of things. Now, one of the things that is asked of me from time to time is, well, why aren't you using foliar fungicides and PGRs? This is something that farmers are using nowadays, and so why wouldn't you use these in the regional variety trials as well? And that's a really good question, and you know, we could sit and have a debate on this for a long time. But what we're really trying to do with these variety trials is take a look at what the genetic potential is of these varieties. And so as breeders, we certainly spend a lot of time and resources breeding disease resistance into our varieties. And so we want to see what the varieties do under natural conditions. With a fungicide, someone observing the trial would never know that one variety is susceptible, yet one isn't. At the same time, we also know that the most effective form of disease control is through genetic resistance, because for the farmer at least, it's the cheapest form of control. PGRs is another one. You know, some varieties are a bit taller and need a PGRs, others not so much. And we know that the window for PGRs is very small, and so different varieties will have different times that are ideal for PGRs. Also, some varieties respond differently than others, and different PGRs also have different effects. So it becomes a very difficult proposition to put PGRs on the varieties. I think in most people's mind, they would rather know at these sites whether or not a variety might lodge, and whether or not, if they do grow it, they would need a PGR or should consider it. Okay, continuing on in terms of what makes a good trial. Good note-taking practices are also very important, and 1 person per trial per trait is a really good idea, and I'll explain what I mean by that. There are some traits that you can't take by going out one time, and maturity, I think, would be a really good example of that, because of course, different varieties have different maturities. And so everyone has slight differences in terms of how they judge maturity. And so it's a good idea for one person to be assigned to go out to do that trial. And in the case of maturity, you need to go out every 2 or 3 days to make those notes. And if it's a different person every time, the data won't be as good. And that's what I mean by several measurements over time and space. Harvest should be done shortly after the crop is mature, so that so that the straw doesn't start breaking down or they're shattering or anything like that. Of course, the combine needs to be properly adjusted. Once the samples are taken, they should be allowed to equilibrate to a common moisture before they're weighed up. Again, all things that allow for better comparisons of the various varieties. Finally, there's also quality control that's done. And Khalil was telling me how Alex had just visited the site back a few days ago and looked at all the trials and passed them with flying colors. If the site fails, the data is not used. And I will say that there's also a financial incentive to that. If the site fails for a reason that was negligence by the cooperator, they will be paid for seeding the trial and getting it going, but they won't receive the rest of the compensation for the trial. So what that amounts to is they'll receive 30% of what the full potential would have been. And so there's good potential to do a good job, or good potential and good incentive to do the job. So what does inspection entail? Well, this actually is taken directly from the form that that is used to inspect the trials. And so certainly different varieties do have different looks, and some look very much similar, but for those that do look different, there's a record of those, and based on the randomization, do they appear in the right places? Okay, and this is something that needs to be checked because, you know, mistakes can happen. If they're not in the right place, then some detective work comes into play. And sometimes these things can be very, very simple. It can be as simple as starting to seed from one corner and then staking it on the other end diagonally through the plots, basically from the back. Things like that. But all of these things need to be known. Does the trial have border plots? Are there visible gradients within the reps or within the plots? What are the problems, or are there problems? Uneven stands, in the case of winter cereals, winter kill, is the site drought stressed, poor weed control, those kinds of things. And notes are taken on that, and then a recommendation is made. Is the trial acceptable? Is it unacceptable or conditional? And in the case of conditional, comments will be made on how the trial could be fixed to make it more acceptable. Okay, once we have the data, of course, that data is subjected to statistical analysis. And I wanted to talk just briefly about that. The data going into the trials needs to be good. Of course, there's always the old adage, garbage in, garbage out. And it's one of the reasons why we inspect the plots. So what the crop coordinators do is they take a look at the data, and is all the data entered correctly, and does it make sense? For example, you know, a decimal might be missing. And so I'm just trying to think here, a height of say 85.5 centimeters, if they're going that, to a decimal, might appear as 855 centimeters. Of course, that doesn't make any sense, but if it's not checked, that's going to throw the data way off and the results way off. And on that, is the data in the right columns? Something that I think happens every year, but the height data might be in the maturity data column and vice versa. And so these things need to be checked to make sure that what comes out is correct. Wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the statistical measures that we use. The coefficient of variation, which is really a measure of variability around the mean for a line and for a trial is looked at. And a trial is rejected if it's over 15%. Ideally, we want below 8%. In some cases, the least significant difference is also reported. And if it is, take a look at that, because in some cases, you may find that although the numbers look different, statistically, they're really not different at all. Once all of this is done, we review the data and that go into the tables. And this is led by an industry expert for each of the crops. And I'll let you know who those are in a sec. Research groups running the trials are invited. The seed companies also attend, as do some of the funders. And there's lots of discussion. And so what does that discussion sound like? Usually there's really no discussion about the yield figures, but there is discussion sometimes about the disease resistance ratings. As I mentioned, over time, the disease organisms change, and so sometimes those ratings need to be changed somewhat. As well, we can't grow every variety all the time. And so we take a look, for instance, at the heights, and based on what the experts and what people know about a line, does the data for height make sense? Or because, for the past couple of years that it's been tested, it's been particularly wet, it looks taller relative to what it should with other varieties. So we do our best to make it very representative. And so the crop coordinators for the various crops are listed here. For spring wheat, it's Doctors Rendawa, Spanner, and Stridehorst, who all work in spring wheat. For winter wheat, it's me. For barley, it's Jim Anderson, a longtime barley worker with Nutrien. If you go way back with Alberta Wheat Pool, Dr. Jennifer Mitchell-Fetch with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, an oat breeder. Mazen Aljara with Alberta Agriculture for Triticale and winter triticale. Dr. Raja Raghupathy on fall rye, and M. Coots on flax. Okay, so at the end of that, you end up with a table that looks much like this. And I've got some little colored suns above some of the columns because I wanted to make a few comments about each one of these. First of all, for maturity, you'll notice that the second column says overall station years of testing, and you'll see that it varies. So what that means is that for instance, right under Carberry, you'll see AAC Elida and then AAC Brandon. Because there are a difference in the number of station years that it was tested, you can't directly compare Elida with Brandon. Again, because there are more sites for Elida. The only valid comparison that you can make in this table, and we try to make this really clear to people over and over again, is that you can only compare back to Carberry. Now, of course, it's no secret, and we all know that people don't use the tables that way. And we're trying to combat that and come up with a new way of showing the data. And I'll show that to you in a few minutes. But I did want to mention that. The next thing is we have divided yield categories into low, medium, and high yielding sites. And that can change from a site can change from year to year as to whether or not they're considered low, medium, high based on essentially the rainfall that they receive. And long-term studies have shown that the major determinant of yield across Alberta is moisture. And so what you can do there is, if you look carefully, you will be able to kind of get an idea what varieties tend to do better under high yielding sites and which ones perhaps do a little better under low, may have a little bit more drought tolerance, as an example. So it is a good tool to use. New for 2020, and going back to the way things were done probably about 10 years ago, is we've moved back from a maturity rating back to the number of days, plus or minus the check. To be honest, I prefer going with a rating because I feel it's more representative of what a variety is. A one-day difference really doesn't mean a lot, and I understand that you know, certainly some people listening to today might have said, well, based on the harvest we had this past year, one day could have made all the difference in the world. And I understand that, but I guess the thing that worries me a little bit is that 104 days for Carberry refers to where, and that's the exact question. You know, in the south, it's going to be a lot less than that. In the north, it's going to be a lot more. And so in this table, as I look down it shows that AAC Magnet is 2 days earlier maturing than Carberry. Well, it could be. Some years it will be. Other years, you know, it could be a lot more than that. And other years, it may not be. And so take those ratings with a grain of salt. Certainly, it does give you relative values, but they're not absolute. And I guess that's the message I want to make. For lodging, of course, what we do is we try to give a rating for those areas when you see lodging. You know, in a dry year, everything has good lodging resistance. Everything stands. But what we're trying to do here is give an indication under lodging conditions what a variety will do. Resistance to sprouting, certainly one that has been an important one this past year. And some people have asked me, well, what about a column for falling number? And that's a really tall order and a really difficult one to do, largely because there are so many factors that affect falling number. It's definitely affected by genetics, and that's what we're trying to get at here with the sprouting resistance column. A line that has good sprouting resistance will maintain its falling number far better than one that's poor. And what falling number refers to is the degradation of starch to simple sugars that starts to occur during germination or during the sprouting process. And you don't actually have to see sprouts on the kernel in order for some of those processes to start and for that starch to be broken down. So what this does is gives you an idea of what the genetic potential for maintaining a high falling number would be. And so again, just off the top on this table, you'll see that Elida is rated at very good. Generally, it will maintain its falling number far better than a line that would be considered poor. Okay. The other thing to remember, and this comes out of some data and a research study that was done in Swift Current a number of years ago, is that varieties that have a higher test weight also tend to maintain their falling number, or their grade, I guess I should say, not falling number. They tend to maintain their grade better than those that have lower test weight. So, you know, if you're looking to maintain grades, high test weight, high sprouting resistance is really important. One last comment, and that's on disease tolerance. We don't report resistance to all diseases. For example, if you go to Saskatchewan and Manitoba, you'll see columns for leaf rust and stem rust. These are generally not concerns in Alberta, and so we don't report them. That isn't to say that you can't go to those pamphlets to take a look at what the resistance is if it is a concern. And by all means, I would also encourage you to take a look at what varieties do in other provinces. So I mentioned that there really are no head-to-head comparisons in this last table. And you know, it's only back to Carberry in that case, back to the check. As a way of getting around this, in 2019, we introduced a new way of reporting the yield data. And what this did was it reported all the lines in the trial for that particular year. And so we still divided things up into low and high yield sites, but you can see there how the varieties changed from year to year, and everything in a column as you move down is actually a head-to-head comparison with the same number of site years. And so this is something that we do want to move to. We're examining exactly how we did it. Back in 2019, there was a problem that was mentioned about it, more of a statistical consideration, and so we're looking at ways to do a better job of this. In addition to these head-to-head comparisons, what we also have on the far right is an overall yield column, which would have been reported in the old table. So this is something to look forward to, and we're always very interested in receiving feedback from you. Couple of things just to close off on this, picking a new variety. I've talked about this for years, and I think perhaps some people think I'm crazy when I first suggest it, but I would say don't look at yield first. That's the last thing you want to look at. Instead, look at the rest of the table and ask yourself what of those non-yield characteristics are most important, and are any of them not important? And just mark it right on the table. And then what rating is unacceptable? You know, is it a poor for lodging? Do you absolutely need a very good or a good? You need to think about those things. And then once those things are sorted out in your mind, mark the varieties that are possibilities based on those traits. And then once those are marked, take a look at which ones are the best yielders under your circumstances. Then if you're looking to change, buy some certified seed, get 2 or even 3 of your top picks and give them a trial on your farm. And I think by going through that type of process, you'll be a lot happier with the variety that you're growing rather than just going with the one that looks really sexy because it's got the highest yield. There may be some disadvantages that were missed. Finally, some closing comments. Of course, you've all heard that Alberta agriculture and forestry is undergoing a lot of cuts. And so we really don't know what the future of RVTs will be. We hope that Alex Fedko will continue in his position. Nobody knows at this point. And so there may be, you know, if there are further cuts and his position was to be eliminated, there would be some scrambling, and we'd have to figure out how things go ahead for 2021. At this point, there's a little bit of a disjointed approach, and in my mind, it really needs to be put under one umbrella. As I mentioned, RVAC does cereals and flax. Pulse crops is separate. It's done by or coordinated